"Please, don't kick me. I'm already hurt," Sarah whispered, and the words arrived like a small, broken sound that filled the diner and refused to be swallowed. The coffee had spread in a dark map across her apron, steam rising in thin threads that smelled of burnt beans and old grease, the fluorescent lights above humming with a thin, electric impatience. She pressed the heel of her hand to the wet fabric, feeling the heat of the spill and the cold of the tile through her shoes, her breath shallow enough that the edge of the counter tasted like metal. Around her, forks clinked, a radio played a distant country ballad, and a laugh from the corner table landed hard, sharp as glass. The man who had thrown the remark was sitting back with a smug smile, his cufflinks catching the light, his voice dropping a blade when he said, "If you cannot pour, you cannot work here." No one in the room stepped forward. In the far booth, a man with a travel coffee cup and sleeves with work calluses watched with an expression that was not shock or curiosity, but something quieter and more dangerous, a recognition that this small erasure of dignity would ripple. He folded his hands around his cup until the paper softened and the heat left a ring on his palm. What if that ring was the first small make of a different choice? If this scene touches you, give it a like and stay with us to see what happens next. Sarah was 27, the main provider for her mother Elena and for little Jonah, who was 7 and still learning to tie his shoes. She had learned to carry mornings in a tote bag and to measure hope in tips. Her shift started at 5 and ended after midnight most nights. The diner smelled of bacon and dish soap. The menus had cheap lamination that peeled at the corners, and the blue plastic stool she favored had a dent where 100 elbows had pressed. At home, a single bulb swayed, and the curtains smelled faintly of cedar and laundry soap. Her phone buzzed with a message from Elena about a school permission slip, and the light that came through the window was the orange of a neighbor grilling. Sarah had once been a barista with dreams of culinary school until bills and a grandfather's hospital note rerouted her. She kept a notebook under the counter where she wrote recipes and lists and the names of people she hoped would hire her. The diner had a manager named Maria who balanced the cash drawer like a ledger of promises, and who stayed late to count change for staff who owed rent. The cook Jorge banged pans with a rhythm like a heart and hummed old boleros. Emily, a regular, always left exact change and a small note that said good luck. Pastor Lewis came sometimes and paid for lunches for pastors who were fasting. Teens with ragged backpacks. Anita volunteered at the soup kitchen across the street and sometimes brought extra bread for staff. Each of these names was a thread in the daily fabric that kept Sarah afloat. She had been on the receiving end of small humiliations before. A whispered correction by a customer about the way she stacked plates. A manager who had once cut her hours after a holiday. A landlord who tapped his foot when rent was late. Those bruises were invisible but cumulative, like salt worn into a seam. The auditory landscape of her life was timers and the hiss of the griddle. The tactile memory was always the scrape of apron against hip. The taste of many evenings was reheated leftovers and the metallic tang of worry. In the midst of that routine, the man in the booth returned to his coffee, and his eyes found hers, not with pity, but with intent. He had a name, but at that moment he kept it to himself. He watched the patterns from the corner like someone cataloging evidence. Before that day, he had shown up without fanfare, worn a scuffed jacket, and listened to the servers tell the same jokes to keep the night from feeling too long. He had a rhythm, a quiet attention, and an ability to hear what others treated like background noise. The antagonist who mocked Sarah was called Richard Lowell, loud-mouthed and certain of his right to dominate a room. Richard made a small scene, clapping his hands and murmuring to a friend named Marcus that the world needed fewer careless employees. His voice scraped the air like a chair leg and made other customers look away. The watcher in the corner tightened his grip on his cup, and the silver band on his finger flashed. Michael Grant. He had rolled up in a modest car, walked in with hands that showed years of work rather than wealth, and now he was cataloging not just the spill, but the way people treated those who served them. Over the next week, patterns emerged. Richard returned 2 more times, and each time his comments cut a little deeper. On one evening he threw a napkin at Sarah and told her to hurry up like the clock owed him. On another, he left a note on the receipt about service that was meant to be a public punishment. Maria confronted him once, voice even, but Richard shrugged and left with a ripple of laughter that sounded like crumbs. Each incident was recorded in Michael's mind like a ledger entry. He watched Jorge in the kitchen flip an omelet and wipe his hands on a towel, watched Emily cover a bill for a stranger, watched Pastor Luis stand and say a short prayer at the counter. The diner itself smelled of oil, of lemon cleaner, and of the rain that slicked the street outside. Michael found himself returning over several days, sometimes settling at the same table, listening to the clink of spoons and the low conversations, noticing the way Sarah straightened her back when she thought no one was looking. He was not a man who sought applause. He edited spreadsheets for a living and had a title at work that opened doors, but that night he had left any sign of authority at the door. What propelled him was a memory of a cashier shut down in front of his own mother years ago, and a refusal to let that be routine for someone else. When the inevitable return came, the confrontation was public and sudden. Richard dropped his receipt and laughed when Sarah stumbled and a mug chipped at the rim. The room stilled. Maria stepped forward and said, "Sir, please watch your language." Richard folded his arms. Michael rose from his booth and walked across the linoleum with a set jaw and a voice that began steady and then found a quiet that made the room listen. "You spilled coffee," Richard said as a provocation. "He spilled the coffee." "She spilled the coffee," Sarah corrected, voice small but present. "Does that mean you can deride her?" Michael asked. "I pay for this table," Richard shot back. "So your money buys rudeness?" Michael replied. "I am Michael Grant, and I will not allow public humiliation in my presence." Richard scoffed. "Who do you think you are?" Maria interjected. "We do not need names and titles here. We need respect." "Respect is earned," Richard said. "Respect is given," Michael countered. "I worked my way up without stomping on people." "Are you threatening me?" Richard leaned in. "I am asking you to account for your actions in this room," Michael said, and his words did something the muffled hum of the diner had refused to do. They cut through with clarity. "If you choose to stay and eat, you will treat our staff with dignity. If you cannot, leave." The room held its breath. Emily at the counter nodded and dropped a coin into a tip jar as if it were a beat of solidarity. Jorge stuck his head out and said, "It is not right to shame someone for a mistake." Pastor Luis crossed himself subtly, and Pastor Luis's voice, low and steady, said, "We will not accept cruelty as entertainment." Another customer, Anita, stood and announced she would pay for Sarah's next shift dinner if needed. After a pause, Richard pushed back, muttered something about being busy, and left with a defeated swagger that sounded strangely thin. The exchange had 6 sharp turns, and every sentence carried a texture the room could feel. The sensory air that followed was charged. The smell of spilled coffee lingered. A fan clicked. The saliva taste of shared relief was almost audible. The diner lights seemed to soften, and the hum of the radio resumed with less edge. The observation had become intervention. Later, in a small office lined with boxes and faded posters for community cooking classes, Michael sat across from Sarah in a conversation that would steer the rest of the story. "Why do you stay?" he asked first, the smell of paper and bleach in the room, the fabric of their chairs rubbing with a faint squeak. "Because I have to," she replied. "Because Jonah needs school and my mother needs medicine. Because my hands know this rhythm." "Would you take something different?" he asked. "I would take anything that keeps our lights on," she said, and the hope in her voice was thin but intact. "I am not here to make a show," he said. "I am here to offer work that respects you and training that could become a path." "Why would you do that for me?" she asked, the question dry like crumbs between her teeth. "Because when I was young, a man sat back and watched and did nothing. I do not want to be him," Michael said, and in the air the words landed like a promise. "What is the work?" she asked. "A role in a new community kitchen program I am launching, a partnership that hires locally and pays a living wage and includes benefits," he said. "Will it require moving?" she asked. "No," he replied. "We will bring resources here." "Will my mother and Jonah be covered?" she asked, and the way she said Jonah's name made him soften. "We will include family health benefits and a fund for school supplies," Michael promised. "You would really hire me?" Sarah asked. "I would," Michael said, "and I will fund training and work with Maria and Jorge to build roles so others can grow." The conversation moved through 6 to 8 exchanges, each one a thread braided into a plan. The room smelled of cheap coffee and new paper as contracts were sketched, and the sound of a pen scratching felt like a small repair in the world. Michael shared that he had started an initiative to partner local businesses with training programs, and that he had learned the hard lesson that impact requires structured investment, not only gestures. He told a brief story about his grandmother, who had been a seamstress, and the dignity she had in a steady wage. Maria agreed to help by drafting shift schedules that would allow training without losing income. Jorge volunteered to teach a basic kitchen skills module. Pastor Luis offered to host a weekend class space. Emily and Anita organized a small fundraising breakfast to seed the program. Names multiplied into action. The offer was concrete, not charity, a job with salary, benefits, mentorship, and a promise that profits would fund a community scholarship. The sensory texture of the proposal was physical: the rustle of paper, the taste of possibilities, the sight of a calendar with dates circled, the sound of a grinder at low volume, the touch of a handshake. Sarah paused, feeling the firmness of the table under her palms, the warmth from the radiator, the sudden lightness around her chest. She said, "If I accept, I want to make sure this helps others here as well." Michael nodded. "That is the plan. This is not about one person. This is about creating roles and training so that families can breathe." The weeks that followed were an architecture of small, measurable changes. 1 month later, Sarah had a new title, a lead server, and had completed a culinary basics course led by Jorge and funded by Michael's program. The diner smell shifted some mornings toward fresh herbs and lemon as a new menu item tested well. Elena's medicine bottle was full, and Jonah's backpack had new pens. 3 months in, the program had turned into a roster of 5 newly hired staff members, including Maria's niece Rosa, a teenage apprentice named Carlos, Anita, who took a part-time coordinator role, Emily, who helped administrate the fund, and Marcus, the bus driver, who now volunteered to help with deliveries. The community saw tangible adjustments. A small stipend for school supplies covered 39 students in the neighborhood last term. A rotating fund paid critical bills for 2 families. And a monthly community dinner hosted 16 volunteers who shared recipes and job leads. 6 months later, the diner had rebranded its community kitchen program with a hand-painted sign. Formal benefits were negotiated, and a partnership with Councilwoman Rivera brought municipal support to expand the initiative to 2 more small businesses in the area. The sensory scene at 6 months was warm light in the mornings, the smell of cinnamon and orange peels, the tactile sense of new aprons, the sound of children laughing at a Saturday breakfast, and the taste of a new signature dish that bore Sarah's handwriting. Local media covered the program, and the numbers told a modest but real story. 5 new hires, 10 families with improved access to health care, and a scholarship fund that paid 3 semesters of a community college program. Names that had been small gestures early on grew into a network. Maria, who reworked schedules, Jorge, who taught the classes, Pastor Lewis, who organized volunteers, Anita, who coordinated donations, Emily, who handled bookkeeping, Councilwoman Rivera, who helped secure funding, and Marcus, who offered transport logistics. The epilogue is less about a fairy tale and more about an architecture of dignity, 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months that shows incremental change stacking into structural impact. 1 month in, there was a paycheck that meant rent could be paid without penalty and a medicine bottle that did not rattle empty. 3 months in, mothers began to plan for school rather than panic at bills, and teens found apprenticeship roles instead of odd jobs. 6 months in, the diner had become a hub of training and a model for 2 neighboring businesses to replicate. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. If you have ever witnessed public humiliation, start your comment with I. Saw and share what you did or wished you had done. Your stories matter because they help us build a map of actions that work and a community that can respond better next time. If you want to help in practical ways, consider donating time to a local training program, paying forward a meal, or supporting community funds that provide healthcare and schooling. If you want more stories of real change, subscribe to this channel. Sometimes one small refusal to watch cruelty become routine is the hinge point for transformation. Subscribe and join us in lifting dignity where it is needed most.